Welcome back to the Roman Britain podcast, episode 9, Verba, Rerum, Teste. Every episode of this podcast has drawn on ancient writers, and we've quoted Caesar, we've cited Tacitus, we've referenced Cassius Dio, we've paraphrased Strabo, but we've never kind of stopped to look at what all these people are doing, what they mean to the discussion that's going on, and why they're so important. So I wanted to take a brief pause here on episode 9 and kind of give them their due, much like we did with in the Welsh History podcast. We looked at some of the early Welsh writers and other writers from other areas who are writing about Wales to kind of give us an understanding of where they're coming from, who they are, and how it affects what they're writing. So I wanted to do that here. So, of course, we want to know who these men are, what they were writing, what were they trying to accomplish with that writing, and why does it matter for how we understand Roman Britain? Of course, this episode is different from the others. There's no battles, no landing beaches, no tribal confederations pressing into contested territory. Instead, we turn to the sources themselves, and we examine the Roman Britain historians and geographers, and those parenthetically near them, and whose texts form the backbone of everything we know about Britain before and during Roman rule from a historical perspective. Our title today, Verba, Rerum, Teste, translates to words are witnesses of events. That phrase captures something essential. These texts are not neutral records. They are shaped by the men who wrote them and the audiences they wrote for, and of course the political worlds they inhabited. Understanding that does not undermine the sources. It makes us better readers of them because we have the context. Archaeology gave us objects. It gives us coins, pottery, bones, timbers, and soils, and it gives us evidence of what people made, trade, ate, and built. But archaeology cannot tell us what people thought. Cannot tell us the names of tribal leaders, the outcome of battles, or necessarily the tribes themselves, or the political reason a fort was abandoned, or why it was even built there in the first place. For that, we need written text. The problem is almost all texts that have been written about Roman Britain were written by the Romans themselves. There are no surviving accounts written by Britons about prior to and during Roman Britain. No Iron Age tribal histories, no native perspectives on the invasion. We just don't have any of it. This absence is not accidental. Reflects the reality of literacy, power, and preservation in the ancient world. What survives was largely what Rome produced, copied, and valued. So when we use Roman sources, we are always reading one side of the story, as you can imagine. That does not mean that the sources are worthless, far from it, of course, but it means that we have to read them critically. We have to ask not just what they say, but why they say it. So as we begin our breakdown, of course, the first person we're going to talk about is Julius Caesar, because Caesar is the first Roman writer to describe Britain directly and in detail. Caesar, of course, was born on 100 BCE and died in 44 BCE. He was a Roman general, statesman, and writer of exceptional ambition. He is most famous for his role in ending the Roman Republic, but his writings have survived as some of the most important Latin texts ever produced. Because of his fame and his notoriety, of course, his records got kept a lot better than others, which is part of the reason why we have so many of them. His work on Britain is found in the Commentary de Bellio Gallico, commonly known as the Gallic Wars. This is his first-person account of his military campaign in Gaul and his expeditions to Britain in 55 and 54 BCE, and, as we've mentioned during the podcast, are obviously pure propaganda to try and effectively big him up. Caesar's descriptions of Britain cover several areas. He describes the geography, the island, its coastline, and its climate. He describes the people, or at least the people he meets in the southeast of Britain. the tribal organizations, their customs, their fighting methods. He gives us the first detailed account of Britain's chariots and tactics used against the Roman infantry. He also records the political landscape. He names tribes. He identifies leaders, like Cassalavanus. He describes the fragmented nature of British politics, and his account of the Thames crossing and the siege at Cassalavanus' stronghold remain the starting points for any discussion of the late Iron Age Britain. So, how do we read Caesar if we're reading him critically? Here's where it becomes essential. Caesar, of course, is not writing a history for future scholars. He doesn't really care about that. He was writing a political propaganda for a Roman audience. The Gallic Wars were designed to justify his campaigns and enhance his reputation, and build support back in Rome. Every difficult moment is presented as a test of Roman courage to overcome. Every tribal leader who resists is portrayed as a dangerous adversary who is frightening enough to make victory meaningful, but ultimately unable to resist Roman determination, and parenthetically Caesar's determination. Caesar writes in the third person. He refers to himself as Caesar throughout it, as if describing someone else's actions. This creates a false impression of detachment and objectivity. Classicists such as Mary Beard observe that Caesar's writings are as much political performance as military record. The man and the text are inseparable. There are specific biases worth noting for Britain. Caesar repeatedly emphasizes the novelty and strangeness of the island. This serves his purposes. The exotic frontier and its conquest was more impressive than a routine campaign. The dangerousness of crossing the ocean, all of that kind of thing. He minimizes his difficulties. The Tide disaster in 55 BC is reported, but handled very quickly. Failures to leave garrisons is not really explained. The withdrawal is presented as voluntary rather than forced, and thus that's what we get. Despite all of this, Caesar's account is invaluable. He was there, he saw the British chariots, he met the British leaders, and thanks to archaeological evidence, we know of these chariots. He crossed the Thames, and no other source can give us that direct witness. The rule with Caesar was always this: trust the detail, question the interpretation. It makes perfect sense when you're talking about a politician, especially one with an agenda driven towards success of his military excursions. The next one we're going to talk about is Strabo. Strabo is the Greek geographer and historian born around 64 BCE. He died in 24 CE. His major work, Geographica, is a comprehensive description of the known world as understood by the Roman-era scholar. Strabo never visited Britain. He gathered his information from earlier writers, traders, and diplomatic sources, which color and tilt his understanding. In Book 4 of his Geographica, Strabo describes Britain in considerable detail for someone writing from afar. He discusses the island's shape, its climate, its agricultural produce, its exports. He describes the inhabitants as taller than the Gauls, with looser habits and more primitive customs. He describes Druidism and its connection to Gaul. Most importantly for Roman policy, Strabo makes the famous argument that Augustus chose not to invade Britain because the tribute paid through the trade was already sufficient to make conquest unnecessary. This is one of our key pieces of evidence for Roman thinking around Britain in the Augustan period. So how do we interpret Strabo? Strabo was a scholar working within established Greek and Roman tradition of geographical writing. He was not a neutral observer either. His descriptions of people tend to follow the standard literary pattern, specifically standard Roman literary pattern. Distant peoples were often characterized as simpler, more barbaric, more vigorous than Mediterranean populations. This is as much a literary convention as an observation. His claims that Augustus considered and rejected the invasion of Britain is important, but it cannot be verified independently. It may reflect genuine diplomatic knowledge, or it may reflect an assumption about Roman rationality that Strabo found intellectually satisfying, keeping in mind that this is a man who's in Greece and nowhere near Augustus. The value of Strabo is the geography and trade. His description of British exports aligns well with the archaeological evidence. Tin, lead, iron, grain, and hides and hunting dogs all appear in the record. That convergence increases confidence in his account. Now we come to someone that we're going to be using a lot of in the coming weeks, and I think it's important to know that he's kind of a main source for a lot of early Roman Britain, and that is Tacitus. He is probably our best source in all of this. And Publius Cornelius Tacitus was born in 56 CE and died around 120 CE. He was one of Rome's greatest historians, and for Roman Britain, he is our single most important literary source. His works that concern Britain most directly are the Agricola and the Annals. He also touches on Britain in his histories. So what are these different documents? Agricola was written around 98 CE. It is a biography of Gnaeus Julius Agricola, the Roman general who served as governor of Britain from 77 to 84 CE. Agricola was also Tacitus's father-in-law, thus the reason for writing the eulogy in the first place. The text covers the early history of Rome and the conquest of Britain, the campaign of successive governors, Agricola's own campaign in northern Britain, and the famous Battle of Mons Greppius, and the early history of the province. Agricola contains speeches attributed to Caledonian leaders such as Calgacus, which include the line that Rome creates a wasteland and calls it peace. Whether or not that particular tribal leader ever said anything like that obviously is doubtful. Tacitus places these words in his mouth, and they have echoed through 2,000 years of history. And honestly, this is a part of the problem with these writers. It's not that they're bad in history, it's that they're bad at taking liberties with history and creating an image of people that we have no way of knowing accuracy of. The Annals covers the reigns of Emperor Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. With it, Tacitus describes the Claudian invasion in 43 CE in some detail, the campaign against Caractacus, and the revolt of Boudica in 60 or 61 CE. His account of Boudica is one of the most dramatic passages in ancient literature. He describes the destruction of Caledonium, Londinium, and Verulinium with powerful detail. His records of Boudica's speeches and desperate Roman counterattacks under Gaius Suetonius Polinius are also a part of the story, and much like said earlier, take it with a grain of salt. How do we understand Tacitus? How do we reflect on what he is? Well, Tacitus is extraordinarily wonderful author, but he is also deeply problematic. He's extraordinary because his prose is both vivid and precise and psychologically penetrating. He reaches you at a level which you can understand and which you empathize with the characters he's talking about. He's giving this image of people in a way that's very Roman, but even in modern society it becomes sort of one of those things, fighting for the underdog, the image of strength being independence and weakness being domination, and all of these things that kind of make up his agenda are something we have to understand. So he's very good at writing it, so there's no doubt you're going to empathize with his points. He understands how power works, how institutions decay, and how individuals are corrupted or ignobled by circumstances. Reading Tacitus feels like reading someone who grasps human nature to a fundamental level. He is deeply problematic, of course, because of his strong opinions about almost everything, and those opinions shape every sentence he wrote. Tacitus dislikes tyranny. He admires traditional Roman virtues. He is suspicious of imperial power, and particularly when exercised capriciously. He wrote under Emperor Trajan after years of what he regarded as the oppression under Domitian. This means that in Agricola, his father-in-law is presented almost without flaw. The difficulties of the British campaign are minimalized. Agricola's recall by Domitian is portrayed as a jealous spite rather than a sound imperial policy. The famous speech of Galgacus should be read as a literary construction. Roman historians regularly compose speeches for their subjects, put words in their mouths, to put it bluntly. These speeches express what the writer believed the character should have said in ideal circumstances, or the argument the writer wants to present in that figure's voices. Tacitus uses these leaders' voices to critique Roman imperialism. That Tacitus himself felt filtered through the voice of these noble barbarians. For Boudica, similar cautions applied. The revolt was real, the destruction was real, but the scale of the numbers, the details, the speeches, and especially the moral framing all carry Tacitus's editorial hand. The rule with Tacitus is to trust the events while questioning the interpretation, and recognize that his portrait of the characters are as much about Roman virtue and vice as they are about individuals described. Next, we move a few years ahead to Cassius Dio, or Cassius Dio. This is a Greek-speaking Roman senator and a historian born around 155 CE and dying around 235 CE. He wrote a monumental history of Rome covering 8 centuries known as the Roman History or Historia Romana. He is critically important for Roman Britain because he is one of the 2 main sources for the Claudian invasion, the other being the fragmentary account in Tacitus. Dio also describes the revolt of Boudica and later events in the province, which, in other words, he bridges some of the gaps that we have. Dio's account of the invasion is found in Book 60 of his history. He describes the initial reluctance of the troops, the crossing of the Channel, the battles against the British forces, the crossing of major rivers, generally identifying them as the Medway, and the final submission of Britain kings before Claudius himself. His account of Boudica in Book 62 is actually longer than Tacitus's version, and differs from it on several details. Dio's Boudica delivers lengthy speeches. His account of the numbers killed in the revolt are different from Tacitus' figures. The 2 accounts do not fully agree on quite a number of details, to be honest. So how do we see Dio? Most important thing to understand about Cassius Dio is the distance in time between him and the events he describes. He was writing about the Claudian invasion nearly 2 centuries after it happened. For the earlier period of Roman history, he's depending entirely on earlier sources, many of which no longer survive for us to read. This means we cannot always know about the reliability of the information, nor where it came from. He was also a senator writing in a period of considerable political instability. His perspective is aristocratic and conservative. He admires discipline and efficiency. He is skeptical of military men who behaved in ways he regarded as undignified. The discrepancies between Dio and Tacitus on Boudica are useful reminders that even when we have 2 accounts of the same event, they do not necessarily agree. Historians must weigh them against each other and against archaeological evidence. Dio's account is nonetheless essential. Some events, particularly the invasion in 43 CE, he is our fullest literary source, which is very important. Without him, our picture of the Claudian conquest would be substantially poorer, and thus he is a necessity. Next on our list is Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus, who was born 69 CE and died sometime after 122 CE. He is best known for his work De Vita Caesarium, The Lives of the 12 Caesars, biographies of Julius Caesar and the first 11 emperors from Augustus to Domitian. Suetonius was a secretary to the Emperor Hadrian for a period, giving him access to imperial archives. This access may explain some of the specific details in his biographies, which are quite in-depth compared to other sources. For Roman Britain, Suetonius is most useful with his biographies of Claudius and Vespasian. His life of Claudius describes the invasion of Britain and Claudius's personal journey to the island to receive the submission of various tribes. His life of Vespasian records Vespasian, who commanded the Second Legion Augusta during the invasion, fought 30 battles and subdued 2 powerful tribes and took more than 20 Oppidia. That reference to Vespasian and the 20 Oppidia is the most tantalizing details in the Roman literature about Britain. Archaeology has worked for generations to identify which sites correspond to these engagements, with Maiden Castle and Hood Hill amongst the strongest candidates. Suetonius is writing a biography, not a history, and that distinction matters. Ancient biographies are not primarily concerned with accurate chronology, or complete coverage, to be fair. Similar to the lives of saints in early medieval writing, I guess. Rather, these sources were concerned with characters. Suetonius organizes his lives thematically, rather than chronologically. He collects anecdotes to illustrate his subjects. Virtues and vices. This means Suetonius is excellent for detail and very poor on context. He tells us that Claudius crossed to Britain, received the surrender of the kings, but does not explain the military strategy or political decision-making behind the campaign. The story of Caligula ordering soldiers to gather seashells on the Channel coast is from Suetonius. Scholars debate whether this is literally true, or greatly exaggerated, or entirely invented. The story has a ring of anecdote rather than history. But that anecdote tells us something real about how Caligula was remembered, even if it cannot be taken as precise record of events. We now move on to some of our later writers. Claudius Ptolemy was a Greek mathematician, astronomer, and geographer working in Alexandria in the 2nd century CE. He dies around 168 CE. His work, Geographia, is a comprehensive attempt to map the known world using coordinates of latitude and longitude. For Roman Britain, Ptolemy's Geographia is our most extensive source of tribal and place names. He lists dozens of settlements, rivers, and tribal territories across the island. Ptolemy's Britain includes names we recognize from other sources, such as Cenobedunum and Londinium, and many others that appear nowhere else. He names tribes across the entire island, including regions far beyond the effective Roman control, such as northern Scotland. His coordinates are derived from calculations and earlier sources rather than direct survey. This means his map of Britain, while impressively detailed, contains significant distortions. Scotland in particular is rotated almost 90 degrees from its correct orientation in Ptolemy's reconstruction. So, again, keep that in mind. Ptolemy is essential for what he preserves, however. Without him, we would lack the names of many British tribes entirely. His list of settlements have allowed historians and archaeologists to attempt identifications of Roman and Iron Age sites across the island. But his data must be used carefully, and the names he records were gathered from various sources over time, and some may reflect earlier periods and some of his own 2nd century CE, and some may contain errors introducing through copying and transmission, even just passed to him being messed up. The distortion of Scotland is a practical reminder that ancient geography writings were not produced with modern precision. Further from the Mediterranean, the more uncertain the data would obviously become. The historians we have discussed so far were writing in the 1st and 2nd century CE, close to the time of the events they described. But Roman Britain persisted until the early 5th century. Its memory lived on long after that. A second group of writers worked in the 3rd and 4th and 5th centuries, and some of them Christian. Some of them working within the traditions of late Roman administration also left traces of Britain in their texts. These later writers present different challenges as they are further removed from the conquest period. They often draw on lost sources we cannot verify, and they write within intellectual and theological frameworks that shape their material in distinctive ways. But they preserve things found nowhere else, and later Roman and sub-Roman periods, they are sometimes our only literary evidence. Now we're going to get into names you're probably familiar with if you listen to the Welsh History podcast. So first up, of course, is Gildas. Gildas, of course, was a British monk writing in Latin, probably in the 6th century CE, around 540 CE specifically. His work, De Excidio et Conquesta Britannia, or The Ruin and Conquest of Britain, is the single most important written source for the period after Roman rule ended in Britain. Gildas is not a historian in the classical sense, or even in the modern sense. He is a preacher and a moralist. His purpose is to condemn the sins of British rulers and clergy and not to provide accurate narrative events. He uses Roman history as a backdrop for his moral arguments. And I would also counter that by saying he also adds a lot of biblical history, in quotes, around his arguments. He very much is acting like the Jeremiah calling back at the Judean kings. His account of the Roman period, of course, is thin, sometimes garbled, occasionally contradicts what we know from better sources. He describes Roman Britain in broad strokes, mentions the building of Hadrian's Wall in confusing terms, refers to Maximus and the stripping of British troops for continental campaigns. But even then, he's vague in the details, which is some of our problem. Yet, Gildas is invaluable. He is a British voice, one of the first, writing in Britain. From within the tradition that emerged from the Roman provincial culture, is when he speaks of the chaos following the Roman withdrawal and the appeals to Attalus for help, the raids by the Picts and the Scots, and the invitation to the Saxons, he is drawing on memory and perhaps earlier texts now lost to us. The rule with Gildas is, of course, to treat him as a witness to the traditions of the memory rather than a reliable narrator of specific events. He tells us what the 6th century British Church believed about its Roman past, and that belief is historically significant even when it's factually imprecise or straight up not true at all, such as the Trojan myth that, of course, slips continually into the history of Britain for many, many centuries to come. Next up, again, later writer, Bede, one of the big authors we've talked a lot about in the past, his Ecclesiastical History of the English People. Bede's, of course, a Northumbrian monk born around 673 CE, dying in 735 CE, so basically the 7th and 8th century. His Historia Ecclesiasta Gentis Anglorum and the Ecclesiastical History of the English People is, of course, one of the more important historical texts produced in early medieval Britain. Bede draws on Gildas and on Pliny and on another author that we're about to talk about, and on a number of documentary sources, including letters to Pope Gregory the Great. He had access to materials no longer surviving independently in addition. For Roman Britain, Bede's contribution is significant in two ways. First, he preserves and synthesizes earlier accounts, sometimes in versions that correct Gildas's errors. Second, he records traditions about Christianization of Britain, including the mission of Augustine in 597 CE, and provides a chronological framework for later and post-Roman periods. Bede writes from a monastic and ecclesiastical perspective. In other words, he's all about the church. And as you can imagine, his history is a history of the church, not the state. Military and political events appear primarily when they affect the church's progress. This shapes when and what he includes and omits. His references to Roman Britain tend to frame the period as a prologue to the Christian mission. Rome matters simply because it brought civilization that eventually carried Christianity. This theological framing should be kept in mind when using Bede as a source for the Roman period, or any period, I would argue. He, much like Gildas, he's very much he has one side, and that's what he's all about. So I'm, Bede is one of those guys who clearly is one of the early historians of England. He basically is our one main source for a lot of what we understand later happens. But at the same time, you always have to take him, much like you do with Gildas, with a mile of salt, because sometimes what he's writing is based upon his ideas of right and wrong, which and his moral ideas about what Christianity is and isn't. So you have to analyze it with that. So now we go back in time and we talk about Paulus Orosius, who was a Spanish Christian priest and historian writing in the early 5th century CE, around 416 to 418. So a very tight period. His work, Historia Adversa Paganos, or the History Against the Pagans, was written at the encouragement of Augustine of Hippo as a Christian rebuttal to pagan claims that Rome's troubles were caused by the abandoning of the old gods. His survey of world history from the Christian providential perspective makes up a great deal of his writings. Rome's greatness and its difficulties are both explained as part of God's plan. His work includes references to Britain's scattering throughout his narrative of Roman imperial history. For Roman Britain specifically, he records events such as the rebellions of Constantine III and Magnus Maximus, which involved the withdrawal of troops from Britain for continental campaigns. His accounts of these episodes, though brief, sometimes preserve details not found in other surviving sources. The challenge with him is that his history, for him, is a vehicle for theology. Events are selected, interpreted, and demonstrated by divine providence. Actual accuracy matters to him, but it always is subordinate to the larger providential argument. Where his account may be checked against other sources, he is sometimes reliable and sometimes not. And going yet further into our Christian sources, among the earliest Christian writers to mention Britain is Tertullian, a Latin theologian from Carthage writing in 200 CE. His work, Adversus Judaeus, against the Jews, he lists Britain amongst the regions reached by Christianity, claiming that places in Britain inaccessible to Rome had submitted to Christ. This is rhetorical flourish rather than historical claim. Tertullian is arguing for the universal spread of his faith, and Britain represents the edge of the world for a Mediterranean writer. Whether Christianity had generally reached Britain by 200 CE is uncertain, though archaeological evidence of Christian symbols from the 3rd century onward make it plausible. Origen, the Greek theologian writing in the early 3rd century, also mentions Britain in passing as a place where Christianity has spread. Again, this evidence is more of Britain's symbolic significance as the edge of the known world, rather than a detailed knowledge of the province or an understanding that it actually did or didn't accept Christianity. These early Christian references tell us something important, that by the 2nd and 3rd century, Britain had become a part of the shared mental geography of Roman Christian world and Roman writers in general. It was real enough to be included on the list of distant regions, even if the details were, of course, vague. Next up is Ammianus Marcellinus, who was a Greek-speaking soldier from Antioch who wrote his Res Gestae, or the continuation of Tacitus's histories, covering the year 96 to 378 CE. He was writing in the late 4th century and is generally regarded as the last significant historian of classical Roman tradition. Ammianus is important for later Roman periods in Britain. He describes the barbarian conspiracies of 367 CE and the so-called Great Conspiracy, in which the Picts, Scots, and the Achati, as well as the Saxons, simultaneously attacked the province, overwhelming its defenses. He records the campaigns of Count Theodosius to restore it. His account of the late 4th century Britain is our fullest surviving narrative for that period. He had military experience himself, and his descriptions of military operations carry a genuine sense of authority. Ammianus is notable amongst late antiquity writers for trying to write in classical historical tradition. He is less concerned with Christian theology than the others, and more concerned with the kind of political and military narrative his predecessors like Tacitus had practiced. The limitation is that Britain is peripheral to his main focus. His detailed treatments of Gaul, Persia, and the Eastern Empire dwarf his coverage of Britain. What he does give us, however, is precise and informed. Our final examples are genuinely well dated and don't really take part a whole lot in our discussions, but we should mention them because they do mention the Roman period. The Historia Britannicum, or the History of the Britons, a text traditionally attributed to the Welsh monk named Ninnius, written around 830 CE, according to a lot of scholars. Its relationship with Roman Britain is fairly complex because it's listing a lot of myth as we go. The text assembles materials from various sources into a narrative of British history from the legendary past through the Roman period and into the early medieval era. It includes sections on Roman emperors who visited and ruled in Britain, and it preserves traditions about figures such as Maximus and the usurpers of the later Roman period. For Roman Britain, the Historia Britannicum is used with great caution, as it is late, obviously, in the 9th to 10th centuries. Its sources are often unclear. It mixes historical tradition with legend quite freely. It records, for instance, traditions about Vortigern and the arrival of the Saxons that may preserve genuine history, memory, or genuine distortion or later invention. This is something, of course, most medieval writers and speakers and scholars will acknowledge quite freely, as that this is a problem across many sources. Scholars continue to debate how much of the early material is genuine, and its value really lies less in the specific facts than what it tells us about how Roman Britain was remembered in the early medieval Wales, rather than a discussion of history or historical accuracy. Taken together, these later writers provide several things that classical sources cannot. They give us perspective on the end of Roman Britain. Caesar and Tacitus cannot tell us what happened in 367 or 410 CE. For that, we depend on all of these other writers. They give us the memory of Roman Britain, what was passed on, what the thought process was amongst the people who succeeded to the territory of what was then Roman Britain, and what they saw as being this surviving peoples and who they were. Gildas and Bede shows us how it was understood by those who came after. That understanding was partial and sometimes confused, obviously, and was always shaped by present concerns. But it does form a type of evidence about what the past was and how it was transmitted to the present in that period anyway. They also occasionally preserve details from earlier sources now lost. Bede had access to texts that we don't believe we have any longer. Other writers drew on records that were not have otherwise survived, and when these writers cite or paraphrase sources we cannot check, their testimony becomes particularly important and particularly difficult to evaluate because of that. Of course, we've spent this episode talking about the Roman and Greek voices. It's worth pausing to acknowledge that what we don't have, obviously. We have no surviving text written by a Briton in this period. Not a single account from a tribal leader, a druid, a warrior, or a farmer experiencing the conquest from the other side. This does not mean Britain had no voices or no perspective. Obviously, humans have perspective and voice. It means that the mechanisms of literacy, record keeping, and text preservation that allowed Romans to write and preserve the evidence of what they did not survive or operate in the same way in pre-Roman Britain. I would argue that there probably was no written perspective in Roman Britain before that. The Druids, who held considerable intellectual and religious authority, are described, at least by Caesar anyway, as maintaining extensive oral traditions. They deliberately avoided writing down their knowledge. Caesar says that this was to preserve the effort of memory and to prevent things from becoming common. However, whatever the reason, the result was a profound asymmetry in our sources. Roman Britain is documented entirely from the Romans themselves. The closest we come up with a way to redress this imbalance is through archaeology. But even there, coins, pottery, settlement patterns, and burial evidence, while it does give us a point of view of Roman society through a British lens, it's still a Roman society at the end of the day. And they don't speak to us in the same way. They can give us some ideas, but they can't give us evidence unless you can interpret what they're doing. Every time we use a Roman source, obviously it's going to enhance the silence of the Britons in the invisible context. It is a thing that we can't do anything about. It's an unfortunate side effect of the situation, but we have to live with it, and we'll do our best when we can to mitigate the worst of it. So, let's give you a bit of an understanding of what this would be like if you were an ancient Roman writer. Picture Tacitus. He's in Rome at sometime around 98 CE. He sits in a room lined with scroll cases. In front of him are accounts gathered over the years, military reports, family memories, testimonies of various men who served in Britain, perhaps documents from official archives. He is a senator, after all. He would have access to things like that. He is writing about his father-in-law, but he is also writing about Rome, and about what Rome does to good men, and about what empire costs. He writes the speech of Caligas, the Caledonian leader, at Mongrampus. He puts in his mouth the words, "They create a wasteland and call it peace." Did he say this? Almost certainly not, in those words at least. But does the speech reflect a reality? Perhaps. Tacitus is not lying. He is writing a tradition that understood set piece speeches as a vehicle for historical truth. The specific words do not matter as much as the insight they carry. That is the challenge of every reader of ancient history must hold in mind. The source is always doing more than one thing at once. No single ancient source gives us a complete picture of Roman Britain. The skills of the historian is in reading them together. Consider Boudicca's revolt. We have Tacitus in the Annals, Cassius Dio in his Roman history. They agree that the revolt happened, that it was serious, that 3 major settlements were destroyed, and that a Roman general eventually defeated it. They disagree on what Boudicca's physical description was. They differ on some of the details of events. They use dramatically different numbers. Tacitus saying 80,000 Britons were killed in the final battle. Dio gives a different figure. Neither number can be verified, nor probably accurate. Archaeology provides a third voice. The destruction layer at Canalodunum is real. Burned buildings and shattered pottery tell us of something catastrophic happened. The archaeological evidence aligns with a broad outline of both accounts while providing nothing about the speeches, the numbers, or even the motivations. Together, text and archaeology create a rich picture that neither could do alone, but the picture always has gaps, and it is, of course, the historian's job to be honest about where certainty ends and inference begins. So, as we conclude in this discussion, Caesar witnessed Britain directly but wrote for political purposes. Strabo described Britain from afar but preserved valuable geographical and economic information. Tacitus wrote with extraordinary literary power but shaped his material through strong moral and political convictions. Cassius Dio wrote 2 centuries after many of the events he describes. Suetonius preserved remarkable detail but cared more about the character than context. Ptolemy mapped a world he never visited, preserving names that would otherwise be lost. Each writer was a witness, and each a partial one. When we use these sources, we do not accept them uncritically. We reach for them alongside archaeology and alongside our own interpretations and alongside an awareness of what each writer is trying to do. That is how, of course, history is made from ancient voices. And in our next episode, we will return to the story of the invasion, or should I say, we will begin our story of the invasion of AD 43 or 43 CE. We will go into further details about that particular situation, about when the Claudian legions made landfall and what that brought to Britain. But until then, thank you all once again for listening or viewing today. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com or on any social media, usually with one exception, at Welsh History Pod, the exception being on Facebook, where it's facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. If you'd like to be a part of helping this podcast financially, you can do so at patreon.com/Welsh History. Just for your awareness, we're going to be putting up our first episode in the coming weeks of our little tour around Britain to some of the sites, both Roman Britain and in Welsh, of historical significance. So I hope you'll join us there. First one up is on Hadrian's Wall, and the next one will likely be about the fort in Caerleon. So with all that said and done, thank you guys once again. Take care. Have yourselves a wonderful rest of your day. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye. The Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information about them, please follow them at evergreenpodcastnetwork.com. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.